Ever feel like just getting through the day, getting out of the house on time, grabbing coffee, making it to work.
Yeah.
It's like its own carefully planned operation.
Yeah, yeah.
Like you're navigating this whole ecosystem just to make it to your desk in one piece.
It's a great analogy. It really speaks to like this idea at the heart of ecology, this interconnectedness. Like it really doesn't matter if we're talking about, a big city or a forest. Life finds these amazing balances.
Right. And speaking of ecology, it looks like you've been going deep on it. Like food webs, biomes, even the biosphere. So ready to take a deep dive with me into how this all works, how life interacts with its environment, from the small stuff all the way to the big picture.
Absolutely. And you know what I think is really neat about ecology? It's not all about rainforests on the other side of the world. It's happening right here. Like even in Illinois, we have these amazing ecosystems. Think about the lakefront or forests, even those little pockets of prairie. It's all connected.
I love that local connection. It actually reminds me of something I saw in Understanding Ecology, one of your sources for this.
Yeah.
They had this example about picturing your school. Right?
Yeah.
So you start with just one student, then zoom out to their classroom, then the whole school.
Yeah.
Eventually you get to thinking about, like, all the schools in the world.
Yeah.
It's a cool way to picture these levels of ecology.
Absolutely. And speaking of levels, you have this note about the biosphere and how it's not just like the surface of the earth. It goes miles up in the air, miles down into the earth. Life has this crazy reach we barely even think about.
I know. It's mind-blowing when you really think about it. Life existing in places we consider extreme, places we can barely even picture. Makes you wonder about life on other planets too, right?
Right. Like it really changes how we define life and where we even think to look for it. There are constantly like new organisms being discovered, new ways life has found to survive. It's humbling.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked big picture, but when ecologists try to make sense of this web of life, where do they even start? I see in your notes you've got biotic and abiotic factors,
Right.
terms I haven't heard since like my first biology class.
Yeah, so think of it this way. Biotic factors, that's anything alive. So animals, plants, fungi,
Right.
all of those are considered biotic, and they're all interacting within the ecosystem.
So it's like they're all playing on the same team,
Right.
but they each have their own role.
Exactly. And just like a sports team needs a field to play on, that's where the abiotic factors come in. Sunlight, water, temperature, all that non-living stuff, that sets the stage for how life plays out.
So even a small change in the abiotic factors, say a heat wave or a drought, that can totally change the game for every living thing in that environment.
Absolutely. Everything's linked.
Now, you've also got habitat versus niche, and I'll be honest, I always mix those up.
Okay, so think of it like this. Your habitat, that's your address. But your niche is your job, your role in that environment.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. So if we use, let's see, you mentioned the bluegill earlier,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Oh, and look at this in my notes. It says that the bluegill is the Illinois state fish.
It is
I had no idea.
that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, okay, a bluegill's habitat. That might be a specific lake in Illinois, but its niche, that's going to be way more specific. It eats certain things, lays its eggs in certain spots, avoids predators in its own way.
Right. It's all about the bluegill's unique place in that lake's ecosystem.
Like each species has its own job description, its own little thing it's really good at, which helps the whole ecosystem function.
Ah.
But what happens when, like, two species have the same job? That's got to cause some
Oh,
tension.
yeah. And that's actually where things get super interesting. It leads us to something called the competitive exclusion principle. Basically, it means that two different species can't survive if they're trying to fill the exact same role
Oh,
in
okay.
the exact same place.
So it's like, back to my job analogy, it's like two people with the exact same resume applying for the same job opening.
Exactly. And only one of them can get hired, right? So in nature, that might mean one species is better at, like, getting resources or maybe avoiding predators.
Right. So if they're both going after the same limited resources, something's got to give.
Right. Someone's got to adapt.
Yeah.
And that competition, it can lead to some really wild evolution, like species developing totally unique niches, totally unique roles just to avoid butting heads with each other.
Yeah, it's like nature saying, okay, there's enough food to go around, but you might need to get creative with how you get yours.
Exactly. And speaking of food,
Oh, yeah.
that actually reminds me, we should probably talk about how energy moves through an ecosystem, how it flows from one level to the next.
Right, like food chains.
Exactly. Food chains, food webs.
It's kind of metal when you think about it. Like one animal's dinner is another one's, oh no, gotta run moment.
Yeah, that's the circle of life.
It really is. And at the center of it all, there are these things called trophic levels.
Yes.
Which is basically like who eats who, right? I've got an example in my notes here.
Right.
It's the classic like burger scenario. So you've got your cow,
Right.
your classic herbivore, munching on some grass. So the cow is the primary consumer, the grass is the primary producer, and then, well, that cow becomes a burger.
Right.
And someone takes a big bite. So we're talking about energy transfer at each stage.
Yeah.
But it's not a perfect system, right? It's not like all the energy from that grass goes straight into the cow.
It's definitely not a perfectly efficient system. Only about 10% of that energy is actually passed on from one level to the next.
Wait, really? Only 10%? What happens to the other 90%?
Well, think about it. When a cow eats grass, it's not like that grass just magically turns into like pure cow energy. A lot of that energy is used by the cow just to live, breathing, moving around,
Right.
maintaining its body temperature. All that requires energy.
So it's like a leaky pipeline. Energy is always entering the system, but there are leaks at every stage.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. And it's a super important concept in ecology. We call it the 10% law. It basically means that ecosystems aren't very efficient when it comes to transferring energy between these trophic levels.
Which explains why you need so many plants at the bottom of the food chain.
Right.
To support a much smaller number of herbivores.
Right.
And even fewer of those top predators up at the top of the food chain.
Exactly. It creates this pyramid-shaped flow of energy, right? Broad base of producers at the bottom, and it narrows as you go up to those higher level consumers. And this energy flow, it's really important for like how stable an ecosystem is, how resilient it is to change.
That's interesting. So any disruption, even if it's at those lower levels, like if there's less plant growth because of, say, a drought,
right,
that could impact the entire system.
Absolutely. And that actually brings us to another really important concept that I saw you had in your notes, and that's carrying capacity.
Right, carrying capacity. So that's like the maximum number of like plants or animals that an environment can actually handle, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like every ecosystem, it only has so much space. It only has so many resources to go around. So the carrying capacity, that's like the maximum number of guests that an ecosystem can support before things start to break down.
So if a population grows too large, if it goes past the carrying capacity, things can get a little messy.
Exactly. It's like trying to fit like way too many people into a lifeboat. Eventually, you just run out of space, you run out of resources.
Right.
And that's when these limiting factors come into play.
Right, those limiting factors.
Yeah, they can either slow down a population's growth or, in some cases, they can even cause a population to crash.
And just to be clear, these limiting factors, those are things that kind of keep populations in check, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they can either be density dependent, meaning that their impact, how much they matter, depends on how crowded a population is.
So like disease spreading more easily when there are more individuals packed together?
Exactly. Or if there's more competition for food or shelter, the more crowded it gets, the bigger an issue those things become. But then there are density independent factors, and those don't really care how dense a population is.
So it doesn't matter if there are 2 animals or 200, those factors impact them the same.
Exactly. It could be things like natural disasters, forest fires, things like that. They can really shake things up regardless of how many individuals are in a population.
It's like rolling the dice for these ecosystems, right? No matter how well a species is doing, these totally random events can happen, and bam, everything changes.
Absolutely. And all of this makes you realize that humans are also a major player in this whole game of ecology. We have a huge impact on these systems.
Yeah, it's like we've shown up to this like perfectly balanced game that's been going on for millions of years, and we're like, okay, new rules, we're in charge now.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes we're not the best at playing by the rules, at least not when it comes to these delicate ecosystems. We've introduced invasive species, pollution. We're changing the climate. These are huge challenges that ecosystems haven't had to face before.
Right, like those invasive carp you had in your notes. Those are a big problem here in Illinois, right? Outcompeting the native fish, messing with the whole food web.
Exactly.
And it just shows it's not even just about like saving the whales, as important as that is. It's about understanding that even if we introduce one new species, that can have ripple effects throughout the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely. It highlights how important it is to think holistically, to think about the big picture, because our actions, even ones that seem really small, they can have consequences that we never could have predicted.
It's a lot to take in, but it's also pretty cool when you think about how everything's connected, from like the tiniest little bacteria all the way up to like the entire biosphere.
Speaking of connections, I did want to loop back to something we kind of glossed over earlier. Like, how does cellular respiration, that whole process that happens inside cells, how does that fit into all of this?
Oh, and you know what? I have a confession to make. I totally got that true or false question wrong, the one in my notes.
Oh, which one?
The one that said only animals undergo cellular respiration. I was like, yeah, sounds about right. But like, plants need energy too, right?
That's a really common misconception. Yeah, plants do get their energy in a different way at the start, right?
Photosynthesis.
Exactly.
They're like the ultimate solar power plants.
Yeah. They're pros at grabbing that sunlight, that light energy, and converting it into a form of chemical energy. They store it as something called glucose.
Right, glucose. It's like plant food, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the thing. Even plants, they need to break down that glucose to actually use that energy. That's where cellular respiration comes in.
Ah, okay. So they make the glucose through photosynthesis, and then both plants and animals, we all use cellular respiration to actually unlock that energy that's stored in the glucose.
Exactly. It's like plugging your phone into a charger. So photosynthesis, that's like collecting energy from the sun, right? Packaging it as glucose. And then cellular respiration, that's like you plugging your phone in to actually use that stored energy.
Oh, okay. I'm getting it now. It's this amazing cycle. Plants grab energy from the sun, package it up, and then everyone, plants, animals alike, we tap into that energy through cellular respiration. But wait, didn't we talk about how only 10% of energy gets passed on from one trophic level to the next? Does that still apply even when we're talking about these cellular processes?
That's a great question, and it leads us to something really crucial. It means that even at the smallest level, that energy transfer, it's still beholden to that 10% rule.
Wow. Okay, so even if we're talking about like a tiny amount of energy to begin with, if only 10% of it makes it to the next level.
Exactly. It shows just how crucial those bottom levels are, those primary producers. Like, if something happens to them, if their energy output drops even a little...
It's going to have this ripple effect throughout the whole food web.
Exactly. It's like, you know those old domino displays where they set up thousands of dominoes and they just need to tip over that first one? That's kind of what it's like. Those producers, they're like that first domino. If they go down, it can impact everything else.
That's a really powerful image. It makes this all feel so much more, I don't know, fragile than I think we realize.
It really is a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And it highlights how important it is that we, like as a species, we understand these connections, especially as we're dealing with these massive challenges like climate change, habitat loss. These things can really disrupt that delicate balance.
Oh, totally. So for all this, I got to ask.
Yeah.
What can we actually do besides becoming like park rangers or something? I mean, how do we take all this and actually like make a difference?
Well, I think a big part of it is awareness, right? Like just knowing how these systems work, how our actions can have these ripple effects. That's a big step.
Right.
And from there, it's about making conscious choices, supporting sustainable practices, advocating for policies that protect the environment, even just being mindful of our own impact, our own footprint on the planet.
So it's not about having all the answers. It's more about like changing our perspective, thinking about the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're part of this incredible system, this web of life, and our actions have consequences. But they can also have incredibly positive impacts, too.
It's both daunting and empowering at the same time,
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think that's a wrap on today's deep dive. To all our listeners, next time you're out in the world, take a moment to think about those connections, those dominoes all around you.
And remember, even small actions can make a difference.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking those curious questions.